The First Society, The Sacrament of Matrimony and the Restoration of the Social Order, was the first book on marriage that I wrote. And it was because we had just become empty nesters.
Right.
And I thought, I am tempting fate. I am going to test the Lord. If I put out books on how to be happily married, Kimberly and I are now in our 47th year. I can't believe that the friendship that we have is flourishing. I've never experienced more of my own weaknesses and limitations as I have in marriage. And at the same time, I would point to that book as the fruit of research that goes really all the way back to the 70s, to the beginning of my own theological and biblical research into ancient Israel, into the notion of covenant, into the idea that covenant is extended sacred kinship. But it wasn't just Israelite families. It was the whole nation of Israel, 12 tribes, hundreds of clans, thousands of households, but one national family there at Mount Sinai. And this Harvard family sociologist by the name of Carl Zimmerman, who I cite in the First Society, would speak of trustee families and how the cultures that became what we would call civilizations were always characterized by a sacred notion of marriage and family that was intergenerational, that focused more upon worship and the hearth as an altar and sacrifice. It was patriarchal, to be sure, but almost by equal measure was it matriarchal, because that monogamous union that even in ancient Rome was sort of held up as an ideal, even if it wasn't realized in practice. And the notion of oath, you invoke the name of the divine. For the sacramentum, that's the term for oath in Latin. Tertullian knew this, Augustine realized it. If you have a promise, you have a contract. If you have an oath, only then do you have a covenant. And I'm convinced that I might be the only person on the planet who finds these things absolutely fascinating and utterly essential, indispensable for rebuilding Catholic marriages and families and really a strong Catholic family subculture, whether it's in Southeast London or in Steubenville, Ohio. But I do think that a lot more work, a lot more intellectual, but also a lot more of the social dimension of homeschooling families. We were just coming from Mass, with Father Mark, and you just saw, 50 or 60 homeschool mothers who are being gathered together here in the quietest, most holy revolution, or perhaps a counter-revolution you could find in this part of London, and it's happening in various places. And I do think, I began that book by referencing Father Donald Keefe, this Jesuit who I went to study under at Marquette. Brilliant, a little quirky at points, but that first doctoral seminar we were studying religion and society, and who was it? Richard John Newhouse, who was still a Lutheran pastor. He later became a Catholic, but he wrote The Naked Public Square to argue that in America, religion should be given a voice, not just, the private values that voters have when it comes to making their choices, but to actually speak out in terms of the person and life and marriage and family with reference to sacred sources. And so we were debating in a doctoral seminar, and Keefe just interrupted the debate, looking out the window. He said, I dare say that if Catholics simply lived the grace of the sacrament of matrimony for one generation, the result would be a Christian society, a socially transformed order. It would be Catholic, regardless of what politicians we elected, what promises they made, what promises they broke, that sort of thing. And I wasn't a Catholic yet. I was a year away from entering the church, but I remember just like zoning out. I just tuned everything out that he said in the rest of his lecture. And I just thought about, if we live the grace of this sacrament and the other 6, I think, more than the legal, more than the political, more than the intellectual and the academic, this would be the pebble in the pond that would send ripples out in terms of political, educational, and all of the other things too. But it really is, I think, the proof of the pudding is how you go home and you treat your spouse. Are you quick to apologize? I'm sorry, not just I'm sorry that you misunderstood me again, And so the First Society was my first foray into something that I'm still trying to live out.
No, but if evangelization is also going to take place through this power of attraction, I think, the large sort of unified pious Catholic family has a huge amount of work to do in that, and really does work, because it's able to bring people into its kind of, and that sort of clan means, because the nuclear family sometimes tends to be a bit isolated, and it's quite difficult to get into it. But those sort of clan systems, are able to welcome people in, new members. In my own family, we've had spouses who've converted and then become as gung ho as any of the cradle Catholics, if not more so.
It's funny because you just sparked something I didn't realize until this moment, that in the last 5 or 6 years since the First Society came out, I have been seeing the sparks in many other families, in the school that I teach at Franciscan University and the College of St. Joseph the Worker downtown as well. But I stepped out. It's sort of an adventure to write the First Society. I would not have written that 5 or 10 years earlier. But once I got that out, I came out with a second book that was the second part in a trilogy that was unplanned from below, but I think planned from on high. The second book was entitled "It is Right and Just: Why the Future of Civilization Depends Upon Religion, True Religion." I was asked to go to Slovakia and give a series of lectures in Košice and Bratislava on this for the Hannes Fellowship. And I co-authored this with Brendan McGinley, a dear friend who has challenged me to kind of think through the implications of marriage and family and to recover the traditional teaching of the church that you find in the Catechism as well as in Vatican II, that just as persons have an obligation to seek the truth and to live it in the worship of God, so do societies, neighborhoods, towns, as well as states and countries. And then the third book was entitled Catholics in Exile, because we might strive for this, but we've got to recognize that even in ancient Israel, you never had a pure theocracy. Yeah. You had various approximations, noble attempts, but typically utter failures. The vast majority of the Davidic monarchs were, abject sinners who impeded conversion more than they facilitated it. And so we really have to adjust our expectations and learn from Jeremiah 29 that, in exile, we can actually form creative minorities through marriages, through families, through working hard alongside of fellow Catholics, but also non-Christians, and do this apostolate of friendship through work that makes, obviously it echoes what St. Jose Maria and Escrivá and all of Opus Dei has been teaching now for almost a century. But I think it's still waiting to be rediscovered by the vast majority of Christians.